Hello, welcome to another video. In today's session, we're going to talk about responses and reaction to the expansion of European empires in the Americas, but also we're going to talk a little bit about Asia and a teeny bit about Africa as well. We're going to see how these reactions and these responses to European expansion gave way also to new and improved forms of political control, thus ultimately solidifying these modes of European control, or this process of integration of a new emerging global economy and society. So one of the things that we have to take into account is that there were passive forces working against the Europeans. The three major components of that were the fact that distance and time, as well as the risks involved in traveling long distances across long time, made it more difficult to control overseas empires. This is difficulty that needs to be taken into account for an order to come from the king in Madrid to the Peruvian highlands. It would take months for a response to arrive. And if a request from the king arrived after a couple of months, 5 or 6 months, then the response by the local authorities would take another 5 to 6 months. And ultimately, that made it much more difficult for the metropoles to control the colonies. They had to cross the oceans, they had to cross difficult terrain. The infrastructure in place was not necessarily the best. And at the same time, there was also the dangers of travel. So for example, it was not uncommon for a large proportion of the crew of a Manila galleon to die at sea. In one voyage, a passenger reported that during the last leg of the voyage, it was rather normal thing for the crew members to dump 3 or 4 people into dead bodies into the ocean every day. Ultimately, that particular voyage had left with 400 people, but only 192 made it to Acapulco. So that particular that particular voyage was one of the most dangerous. But sailors everywhere were subjected to the ravages of diseases such as scurvy, which is vitamin C deficiency, that causes all sorts of problems in the human body and ultimately leads to death, but other diseases as well. So ultimately, many European powers elected to govern their colonies through something that is referred to by some historians as benign neglect. That is, leave them be as much as you can. Ultimately, what you're interested in is in getting taxes from your colonies and getting raw materials, or getting the silver from the mines and getting the revenues. That's all that you're really interested in. So in general terms, you can let go of the more particular contingencies. That would be true for places like New England, but also places like Peru and New Spain, and even places like the Philippines that were fairly remote to govern. So that's why local intermediaries, say indigenous allies or local elites, were essential for governing these sprawling overseas empires. So there were these passive limits or passive resistances to European powers that has nothing to do with the people involved. It has everything to do with the difficulties of logistics and the limitations of technology at the time. So that's one thing to take into account. Another good example, in the case of Africa, well, the Europeans were basically facing powerful local rulers. They were also challenged by local diseases such as malaria and yellow fever, or the tsetse fly, the sleeping sickness. These types of sickness limited the Europeans' capability of going inland to a great degree. One example of a powerful local ruler that I found particularly fascinating is that of Queen Njinga of the Kingdom of Ndongo. She traveled to the Portuguese settlements in what is nowadays Angola. She was baptized as Ana de Sousa, and then in 1624 she was elected queen by a faction of the kingdom of Ndongo upon the death of the former king, her brother. But a rival faction wanted a different ruler, and they received help from the Portuguese. So for almost 3 decades, she battled the Portuguese, personally leading her army against them, the Portuguese and their local allies. She got some assistance from the Dutch when the Dutch advanced into Central Africa in the context of larger European conflicts. Eventually, she managed to conquer, while still fighting the Portuguese, she managed to conquer the kingdom of Matamba in the 1630s. And when the Portuguese recovered themselves, she was able to retreat to Matamba. Finally, between 1655 and 1663, she reestablished peaceful relations with the Portuguese, and she allowed some degree of evangelization or some degree of a compromise with Catholic missionaries in her lands. We will get to that when we talk about global syncretism and global religious transformations at the time. But yeah, so rulers like her were a fairly substantial limit to European power in Africa. Then you had the very same people who had conquered the empire were obstacles to the assertion of the power of the crown. Hernán Cortés resisted attempts at centralization by the Spanish monarchy. And then in Peru, we have Gonzalo Pizarro, who was a half-brother of Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of Peru. And he outright rebelled in 1544 against a new viceroy who wanted to enforce the new laws that had been decreed by Emperor Charles V that granted more protections to the indigenous peoples. These were the laws that had been developed after Bartolomé de las Casas campaign for better treatment of the indigenous in the Americas. So he was rebelling against that. He was having none of it. He wanted to exploit the indigenous peoples that he thought were meant to serve him, and he didn't want to do any compromises, and he had a substantial followers, substantial host of followers. It was only when the new viceroy offered a general pardon and repealing of those laws protecting the indigenous people, that Gonzalo Pizarro lost support, and eventually he had to surrender, and he was beheaded. But you see, so this position by the empire trying to protect their indigenous subjects created all sorts of problems and rebellions from white settlers. Then there was passive resistance. The indigenous peoples, of course, were left in a very difficult situation. Matthew Smith has a paper. Historian Matthew Smith has a paper on the conditions of the indigenous population in Potosí. Potosí was, of course, the source, the biggest source of silver in the world at the time. And overnight, a boom town was created, and right next to this new source of silver from the Cerro del Potosí. And the Potosí mining industry had very, very harsh conditions, very harsh working conditions, and the indigenous populations were subjected to work in these mines with mita labor taxation system. Many indigenous people migrated to escape the mita. Some decided to stay and decided to become permanent workers which would also translate into better financial gains for themselves. But if the conditions were bad in Potosí, and here's an image of what the conditions were like. So very deep shafts, substantial risks of collapse, people carrying loads of materials on their backs, just overall harsh, terrible conditions. And then we have, if the conditions in Potosí were bad, the conditions in Huancavelica were even worse. You see, to process the silver that was being mined from Potosí, mercury was needed. And fortunately for the Spaniards, they found a large mine of this resource in the relatively nearby place of Huancavelica. Huancavelica is located in Peru, present-day Peru, whereas Potosí is in present-day Bolivia, but still relatively close. So Huancavelica had a series of mercury mines, and mercury was needed to refine silver that was coming out from Potosí. However, mercury is very poisonous. So poisoning from mercury and exposure to mercury and carbon monoxide, as well as pneumonia and the danger of cave-ins, all of these things contributed to the work environment in Huancavelica being absolutely horrifying. So another form of passive resistance was mothers actually naming their sons so that they wouldn't be required to participate in the Mita of Huancavelica. So that was really, really harsh. Then we have active resistance. Of course, indigenous peoples were not ready to submit passively to colonization, and right from the get-go, we have a series of indigenous uprisings. If we go to Mesoamerica, we have the Mixton War, followed right after by the Chichimeca War, and the Tepehuan Revolt after that. So as the Spanish drive the frontier further and further into northern Mexico, the local Chichimeca peoples are up in arms against them every step of the way, and the Spaniards are only able to subdue them with the help of their Toltec, their Tlaxcalan and Mexica and Otomi and Purepecha allies, the sedentary indigenous peoples. So the semi-nomadic peoples of Central and North Mexico were very difficult to bring in the fold. And you can see these various images of them resisting via ambush and other guerrilla type tactics. Further north, a couple of, some 80 years after the Spaniards had entered New Mexico, the Pueblo people of New Mexico revolted. In 1680, a revolt that seemed to have been triggered by the governor's attempt to establish more orthodox religious practices among the population, so trying to eradicate local religious practices and substituting them with Orthodox Catholic religious usages. This rebellion completely rid New Mexico of Spanish rule for the next 12 years. So Pope virtually made the Pueblo Indians in New Mexico an independent nation once again. And it took quite a substantial drain of resources and negotiation for the Spanish to be allowed back and to rule over the Pueblo peoples. And the Spanish never tried to enforce Catholicism in such a thorough way. Instead, they had a policy of largely don't ask, don't tell, try to ignore ongoing native indigenous practices. And then we have the Mapuches. The Mapuches were even more radical. Uprisings of the Mapuches in southern Chile effectively ended Spanish colonization south of the Biobío River. The Mapuches are said to have killed 3,000 settlers and kidnapping over 500 women. And we see them taking over technologies such as the usage of cavalry in warfare and using it very successfully to defeat the Spanish armies and really put a stop to Spanish conquest in the region. They stop it in their tracks, like I said a couple of lectures ago. So the Mapuches were able to eradicate Spanish presence in the southern part of Chile. Moving on to non-native communities, we of course have to talk about, and this is what the reading, the required reading for our discussion session is about, Maroon communities. Now, people that were subdued to slavery always resisted bondage and always continually tried to escape. And many did so. And escaped slave communities, which in Spanish Americas are called palenques or quilombos, and quilombos in more in the Portuguese speaking areas, palenques in Spanish speaking areas, palenques and quilombos and freedmen communities and runaway communities in French and British and Dutch and Spanish and Portuguese colonies all over the Americas sprung everywhere throughout the colonial period. If you have a list of countries that have a history, and other places and states in Mexico and the US that have a history of Maroon communities. And of course, the largest one and perhaps the most famous one is Palmares in Brazil, but there are many others that took place everywhere in the Americas. So that was another very clear form of the limits of European control and the resistance and reactions to European hegemony. Now, in the cities, because Maroon communities mostly pertain to the rural world, urban communities were also rebellious, in particular in large places such as Mexico City. Mexico City had a very large a revolt, a riot in 1692, when the price of tortilla, the price of maize, of corn, skyrocketed, and people of indigenous backgrounds, people of African descent, people of Asian descent, all band together and assaulted the marketplaces and the symbols of royal power. They in fact torched the vice-regal palace, and you can see in this image painting of the Plaza Mayor of Mexico City. This is only a portion of the painting. You can see the vice-regal palace, and you can see the half. The right half of the palace is completely missing because it had been destroyed in 1692. So it was a substantial revolt, and it took a lot of negotiation and a lot of compromise and a lot of brute force to put down. Manila also features an even more brutal revolt. Here we have an image of Manila with the Intramuros section, the walled city, and then you have the several neighborhoods, several barrios around it along the Rio Pasig. One of them was the Parian, where the Chinese immigrant population was put to live in a ghetto-like community. There were limits to Spanish power on the Philippines as well. The Spanish took a long time to feel safe from invasion from China. And even though there were Spanish projects to conquer China, they were also afraid that they were open to a Chinese invasion. And in fact, they were invaded by a Chinese pirate called by the Spanish Limahon. His Chinese name was Lin Feng. He invaded and almost succeeded in taking over the Philippines from Spain in 1574, only 3 years after the Spanish had arrived. The Spanish were able to defeat him, but he came very close to kicking the Spanish out of the Philippines. And there were also intrinsic dangers. There were revolts in the Philippines against tribute, only to mention two of the most important ones, the Pampanga Revolt in 1585, and then 4 years later, the Cagayan and Ilocos peoples were again revolting because they did not agree with Spanish tribute. And then, of course, there were the Chinese of Manila. Now, Manila was profoundly dependent on this immigrant community. The Chinese were the ones that connected Manila to the wider world, connected Manila to the Fujian region of China. They were the craftspeople. They were the barbers. They were the makers of textiles and pottery and ceramics and all sorts of utensils, and they were needed to run the city. There weren't enough Spanish people there or even Filipino population to run the city properly or well. So the Chinese of Manila were a very important part of the community. And the Spanish knew that they were dependent on this Chinese community. But then, again, they were also afraid that Chinese population of Manila would turn against them if there was another invasion from China. So they were feared as a fifth column against them. So that led to a series of what are called Sangley revolts. So the Chinese of Manila revolted or were attacked, harassed by the Spaniards. At least three are the most important ones in the 17th century. And in the 1603 one, for example, ended up with the killing of 24,000 Sangleys, who had earlier than that killed quite a few Spaniards. Eventually, the Spanish were able to regain control of Manila in all instances, thanks in part to the help of the Japanese immigrant community that also lived in Manila. All right, so let's move to a completely different place in the world, and let's talk about the colony of Virginia. Now, the colony of Virginia, if you recall, had been founded by the British in 1607, and there were strained relations. There were difficult relations with the Powhatan people who lived along the river where Jamestown, the capital of Virginia, had been founded. So the colonists of Virginia fought a long series of wars against the Powhatan people, and they came very close to being defeated by the Native Americans. That's the context where we have the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe. And here we have an image of her baptism right before her marriage to John Rolfe. And this marriage took place in order to secure a ceasefire or even an alliance with the Powhatan people. But despite what you might have heard from Disney, the Powhatan ultimately were not interested in color with all the colors in the wind, but rather coloring the streets of Jamestown red with the blood of the colonists. And that's what happened in 1622. Now here we have perhaps an exaggerated depiction of this event, but the Powhatan did attack Jamestown and did raid Jamestown in 1622 and almost completely wiped out the colony. In fact, it was this attack that prompted the English crown to make Virginia an official royal crown. So again, this resistance by the Native Americans prompted larger control and more sophisticated means of control by the European colonizers. In New England, further north, remember we have Virginia in the south and we have New England in the north. Both are English, but they're not the same. We have first the Pequot War. This was a war against the Pequot people. At first, the New England settlers have found it a little bit challenging to face this group of people, but eventually they rounded up. They managed to secure alliances from other indigenous people, and eventually they managed to lay siege to the Pequot settlements, and they basically eradicated the Pequot after this uprising. To the right, you can see the English arquebusiers and their Indian allies armed with their bow and arrow, attacking the Pequot fort. This was followed a couple of decades later by a much larger conflict, the King's Philip War. King's Philip War was a Wampanoag uprising. The Wampanoag was the major Native American group that rose against the British, the English in New England, the New England settlers. They were able to attack many settlements in Massachusetts and other colonies in the New England area, and they nearly succeeded in freeing themselves from the yoke of the English. However, finally, the New English settlers managed to regroup, and they organized a harsh reprisal against the Wampanoag, and eventually they managed to defeat them narrowly, killing the leader of the insurrection, known among the British as King Philip. He finally was killed in 1678, and the rebellion came to a close. The French also had to deal with the Native Americans in a long series, a protracted series of wars called the Beaver Wars, because of course they were fighting for access to beaver. Remember, beaver hides were a prime commodity and the basic, the lifeblood of the Canada colonies of the French. So the Beaver Wars are a series of intermittent conflicts between the French and their native allies against the Iroquois. And it resulted in the annihilation of, for example, the Huron people, who had been very weakened by an outbreak of smallpox brought to them by Jesuit missionaries. We will talk about that when we talk about global missionaries and religious syncretism. But it almost resulted in the destruction of New France. The destruction of the cities of Montreal and Quebec nearly took place, and it was only avoided with direct intervention of the crown. So very much the same thing that had happened that happened that we just talked about in the case of Virginia. So in the same way as Virginia became a direct royal colony, New France also became a direct royal colony. It was no longer a private venture. And the French king had to deploy 1,200 professional soldiers to fight against the Iroquois. And they finally managed to turn the tide in favor of the French in 1665. Nonetheless, the French were unable to completely conquer the Iroquois, and they had to come to a diplomatic agreement. So finally, in 1701, a great peace was signed between the French and 39 First Nations. First Nations is what they call the Native Americans in Canada. And this finally brought an end to the conflict and finally secured the colonies of New France. Up to that point, the French presence in North America was very much hanging from a thread. So very close to losing this colony to the Iroquois. So again we have how the resistance of indigenous communities has a response from the colonizers that ultimately led to more effective means of control. Here we have the copy of the Great Peace of 1701, signed by the governors of New England and New France, and also the different representative of the First Nations. Then we have another example, similar to Gonzalo Pizarro's rebellion in Peru. We also have white settlers rebelling against royal control. And this is Bacon's rebellion. It was a rebellion, in 1676, a rebellion of white settlers seeking more rights and a harsher policy against Native Americans. These were people who were not necessarily in the higher ranks of society in Virginia, and they demanded less taxation and a more clear anti-Native American policy from the governor. So they wrote a document, the Bacon's Declaration, and they basically say, hey, you've raised unjust taxes upon us. The governor has tried to assume the monopoly of the beaver trade. We also want access to the beaver trade. We want to be able to enrich ourselves with the resources in this continent. And also we are protesting against a policy that we believe has protected, favored, and emboldened Indians, that is Native Americans, against His Majesty's loyal subjects, that i.e. us. So you have turned the Native Americans against us, and that's why these white settlers rebelled, and they ended up burning Jamestown to the ground. So ultimately, Jamestown was not destroyed by the Powhatan Native Americans, but by the settlers, the British, the English, sorry, not British yet, the English settlers themselves, who destroyed the town in 1676. So here we have a series of examples, right? This is just a selection of various examples so that you can see how there was widespread resistance to colonization and widespread resistance to this articulation of a more integrated global system. And these responses showcase the fragility of these new power structures, not only their weakness, but also their need to establish themselves more fully. Ultimately, these reactions reinforce systems of control, at the same time establish some compromises in order to exercise power. So we have, in New Mexico, we have this policy, don't ask, don't tell. I don't want to know if you are a devout Christian or if you are secretly still practicing your native religion. I'm not going to ask too many questions because I don't want to find out. Because if I find out, I have to repress you, and I know that you're going to rebel. So I won't do that. So there were limits to how much Europeans were able to shape the world in the way that they perceived that they should change it. Many limitations to power. At the same time, those people who were responding to these processes they also needed to compromise. For example, the Mitayos in Huancavelica and Potosí had to comply with this Mita system. They had to find ways within this system to negotiate, to acquire a higher standard of living, and try to navigate this very complicated system, right? So ultimately, these responses ended up solidifying the integration of the emerging global economy, but in new ways. France had to develop this diplomatic alliance system with the Native Americans. They weren't able to just conquer them outright. So there's a balance, right, between these two forces. But ultimately, the Great Peace, secured by the French, opened up the Iroquois in a bigger way to forces from Europe, and market forces that would completely shape these societies in the 18th century. So those are issues that we could explore and discuss further in our discussion session. I thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video soon enough. Thank you so much.